So welcome this afternoon, and we'd like to thank him for accepting to give one of the public webinars that we give during the semester. As I mentioned earlier, we give at least 3 of these public webinars, and one of the intentions is to give the former fellows and the people out there a sense of the fellows that we have, the different and also to attract them to think of coming to STIAS, to give them a sense that it's a very nice place to be. So thank you again for being part of that conversation and getting the next call. As usual, we start with the housekeeping things, and in this particular respect, we would like to say bon voyage to 4 fellows that will be leaving this week. Abeni Beshiru will be leaving. Eric will miss the conversations and the songs, but we expect that both Abeni and Beshiru will come back with enough material for Melanie to come up with a mathematical formula and models, because she's also leaving this weekend. And Edward, who presented on Tuesday, will also be going back to cold Stockholm, and just trying to make sure that you don't go. So for those ones that are going, we wish them good speed and travel, and we expect to see them back. Now, second thing is that with the public webinars, we usually ask a colleague, either from the Stellenbosch University or the broader Western Cape environment, to introduce the speaker. And for this particular webinar, we've asked Professor Christine Anthonyson, who is going to introduce Caroline, and I had this problem of Caroline and Christine, and first time I got it wrong. I said Caroline was going to introduce Christine. Christine is emeritus professor in the Stellenbosch University Department of General Linguistics. She received a PhD at the University of Vienna, and she was working then on critical discourse analysis as a critical theory, and she was applying this to analyzing media discourses produced under especially repressive environments. And her current research focuses on discourse studies, critical discourse analysis, and social aspects of bilingualism and multilingualism. She has a project where she's looking at different aspects, discourses of coming to terms with traumatic past, and also language discordant discourses between health workers and patients, especially in HIV and AIDS clinics. She's also undertaking an interdisciplinary project that investigates characteristics of language shift from Afrikaans to English. And so I think Yezi would be a good conversation in that particular respect. And she's one of the editors of the Stellenbosch papers in linguistics, and also an STIAS class, and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Language and Politics, and also multilingual mergings. So we'd like to welcome Christine to this space, and also to, I won't say if she wishes, but to ask her to introduce Caroline. Because if I say if she wishes, she might say I don't wish. So please, Christine.
This is good afternoon, and then thank you, Edward. You actually, you introduced me as I was in my past because I'm retired. You may have noticed.
Yes,
that, I actually am very pleased to have been asked to introduce Caroline for various reasons, but also because we've been very long-standing colleagues, and I followed, have been following still Caroline's work with so much admiration, actually, and was pleased that she actually could spend a couple of months here and in Stellenbosch to continue with extremely interesting work. For those who haven't got the topic already, it's we're talking about towards epistemic justice, language, identity, and relations of knowing in post-colonial schools. So, Caroline, if you ever wanted to see a person who can combine academia and activism, I think you've got a very good example in Caroline. Her interests very broadly have been in language, literacy, education, and social justice. She talks of epistemic justice. I would say epistemic justice is a way of considering how in education we take care of justice, social justice issues. And let's go back about 30 years when Caroline was working at an NGO specifically interested in the education of adults for literacy. At a time which we really can't remember anymore, when a very large percentage of the population actually had not had access to the kind of education that developed literacy. So in 1992, she did a commission that was, she was commissioned by the SART to, which for those who don't know that one, Congress of South African Trade Unions at the time, which was quite an important one in the transition to democratic government. And she was asked to develop proposals for a national curriculum framework specifically for adult basic education. And then in 1993, a year later, the ANC at the time asked her to help with the implementation plan for education and training. So another very strong contribution that she could make there. She helped to negotiate the plans with various bodies in the handover of power to a democratic government. And then she became part of the task team who took that foot forward as from 1994. Then, still continuing with the work that she did, what I call activist work, was that between 2007 and 2009, she worked on language transformation plan under the auspices of PRESA and the Western Cape Education Department. And then moving from adult education, it was about younger children in education. The idea at the time was to improve the number of years that we have mother tongue education. And both adult education and bringing in more African home languages into the school curriculum have both been enduring issues that I think Caroline still carries as ideals. I'd like to refer just to where the two of us met. We were both lecturing and researching at the University of the Western Cape in the late 1990s, early 2000s. She combined her academic work with some of the practical issues that she was busy with, and she registered for a PhD, which was supervised by a colleague in South Africa, but registered at the university in Stockholm. So in 2009, she completed a PhD on basically adult and basic education in South Africa. So I can probably list, if I start going into numbers, people who want to count, we start counting how many journals, how many journal articles, how many books and edited books and chapters and books. I'm going to stop at this point and just say she was twice awarded Best Teacher Award for Master's Teaching. She's been a Fulbright Scholar at the University of New Mexico in the United States. She was a visiting scholar at STIAS, University of London, Ghent in Belgium, University of California in Berkeley. So she is an author, an editor, a reviewer, a person who does individual and collaborative research. She's a teacher, a supervisor, a mentor to quite a few. Caroline, I could go on and take up more of your time, but just to say, first, I think Caroline is well equipped to talk about social justice in education. She is also, I think, one that will inspire us to reflect on how to create new realities in contexts still hard to imagine, such as post-racial educational dispensation, to maximize possibilities of hope. So, Caroline.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Chris, for your finely crafted approach to this introduction. You've always been a deeply valued colleague. I'm very grateful today. I follow my colleagues in thanking everyone at STIAS for creating this remarkable space. I appreciate every single thing about it, but especially Edward's gentle, witty introductions, Christoph's deft and tactful chairing, and all those who contribute to the seemingly effortless organization behind the scenes, so Marie, Gina, Karen, Lennon, and many others. I appreciate most of all a space where ignorant questions are met with unfailing courtesy and exquisite grace. In fact, for me, grace is the word that best encapsulates STIAS. It's a joy and privilege to be here with friends and colleagues, new ones at STIAS, and many of those with whom I've worked for many years, who I'm so happy to see online. I hope I can do justice to them through what I present today, as they have all influenced my thinking profoundly. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the central contribution of three people who completed their PhDs through the NRF grant that we had for a 6-year project, and who are now doing excellent work in other universities and other countries. First and foremost, Dr. Basira Bello-Martingele, whose work is central to the argument I make here, but also Dr. Gwen Tata and Dr. Michelle Berger. I also acknowledge the many translators and transcribers who make this work possible. Now to the body of my talk. I need to say immediately that I'm not a philosopher. I approach the question of epistemic justice through language and linguistic practices. Nevertheless, if we have learned one thing from the pandemic, it is that many of our philosophical understandings need updating. For example, we can think of Nietzsche's famous maxim, "What does not kill you makes you stronger." And here is one idea of how to update that. In a more sober vein, the same can be said of colonialism. So when I talk of post-colonial schools, this is strictly in a temporal sense, that is the formal declaration of the end of colonialism or the end of apartheid through transfers of power to democratic governments. But in fact, when we talk about post-colonial in South Africa, the response is general. What post-colonial? The colonizers are still here. And in addition, not only are the colonizers still here, the social classification of populations based on the idea of race, which was, of course, one of the foundations of colonial power worldwide, is still very much present, and not only in South Africa. One has only to look at the daily news from the USA to understand this. So colonialism sends its tendrils into the present, not least into education, in the form of unequal relations of power, knowledge, gender, ethnicity, and language, and their many entanglements. The Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano has termed these continuing effects of colonization coloniality. This term designates the race-based structures of power that survive colonialism and are reproduced in the name of progress and development. This is what Walter Mignolo calls the dark side of modernity. And as Vasquez says, the grammars of power have been destabilized, rearranged, but of the system. And it's important to note that there's no single logic of coloniality. Its inflections are an effect of multiple processes that are dynamic, heterogeneous, and unstable. This then brings us to the question of epistemic justice. What is it, and why should we be concerned about it? This is an issue which touches obliquely on the work of almost everybody in this room, directly on the work of a few, and deeply on the experience of many. I realize there's a lot of expertise in front of me, and I look forward to engaging with it. Miranda Fricker and Boaventura de Sousa Santos define epistemic justice as challenging forms of unfair treatment that relate to issues of knowledge, understanding, and participation in communicative practices. So it addresses two of our most basic everyday epistemic practices: conveying knowledge to others by telling them, as I'm trying to do to you, but also making sense of our social experiences. So it is centrally concerned with who we recognize as legitimate producers or holders of knowledge, and crucially for this research, through what languages. So as you would have seen in the abstract, this paper aims to expand understandings of epistemic justice by addressing it from the perspective of language. In particular, it looks at how policies and practices that embrace a multilingual episteme can construct more egalitarian, just, and ethical conditions for learning. The episteme is, of course, a proposed term for the orderly, often unconscious structures underlying the production of scientific knowledge in a particular time and place. It is these structures that form the conditions of possibility for knowledge. So if you change the structures, then the hope is that you can also change the conditions of possibility. I don't think I need to give this example, but just if you think of the hard sciences and the scientific study of ice and glaciers, ice is a material that has historically sat uneasily within traditional northern divides. It's seen as either solid by physicists in laboratories or fluid by glaciologists studying its dynamics. Plant ecologists see glaciers as inert substrates, and microbiologists see them as living environments. So these are differences among established northern fields of study. For indigenous perspectives outside these frameworks, there is yet another perspective. For some indigenous groups, glaciers are sometimes solid, sometimes liquid, and always flowing. They are seen as shapeshifters of great power, and like tidal zones, they signify transitional spaces. In the same way, the language sciences differ in their approach to language. For psycholinguists, it tends to be a system with clear boundaries abstracted from everyday practices and sitting somewhere in the mind. These are overgeneralizations. And for sociolinguists, language is a social construct. Its features and borders shaped by everyday interactions. So as with glaciers, we can see languages as both fixed and fluid, as being and becoming, depending on the scientific lens. But a southern lens on language goes further. And here I'd just like to make a quick aside about the terms North and South. For most of the scholars that I work with, South is understood metaphorically. It's not a geographical location. It indicates a position and a politics. And it's possible for the South to exist also in the North in terms of marginalized, excluded, minoritized populations. So when we talk about Southern lens, it's a metaphorical lens. It doesn't mean only from countries located in the South. From a Northern perspective, given the histories of nation states and their strategies to unite around one standardized variety of language, monolingualism is seen as the norm. Multilingualism tends to be seen as the addition of several clearly distinct languages, so 1 + 1 + 1. And it's often an elite accomplishment for those who already have high cultural capital. They have more cultural capital. And in northern contexts, often there are other kinds of invisibilized multilingualism, which are languages not recognized on national or European, North American linguistic markets. For example, in Sweden, Somali, Turkish, Arabic. And these are often seen as an aberration and something to be removed from people as soon as possible. Not removed, but it's certainly not developed in education in any way. And this was the ethos carried by colonial language policies, which continues today. In the South, by contrast, multilingualism is a norm. It's taken for granted in most places and the basis of everyday interactions. Ramakant Agnihotri in India has suggested several decades ago that multilinguality or a multilingual capability comprises an integral condition of what it means to be human. So it's an essential human capability. I can't think of another word right now. So what happens if we use this lens in multilingual classrooms? This is what I'll be looking at today. I'll be looking at how young adolescents, so grade 6, and the data I present today, but we looked at many different learners, and how they use the languages they have at their disposal to negotiate social and academic identities, so to get along together and try and come across historical divisions in some way, find ways of living that do not harm one group or another group, and reconfigure linguistic hierarchies of language. And so the argument here is that if we see multilingualism as a norm, it can offer alternative angles of vision and perhaps help transform education. So Miranda Fricker distinguishes two kinds of epistemic injustice. A testimonial injustice is when a hearer wrongs a speaker in their capacity as a giver of knowledge, and so as a rational being, which she considers a capacity central to human value. It occurs, for example, when someone tries to tell another person something but is not believed or taken seriously. Now, of course, this happens every day, but it becomes an epistemic injustice when the person is not considered credible because of who they are perceived to be. So, in other words, because of the color of their skin, their social class, the languages they speak, gender, ethnicity, or any other form of difference. And we can think contemporary discourses around mansplaining as one manifestation of this. And we have an historical reference in the courts from 1907 where Chief Justice James Rose Innes in South Africa stated that evidence tendered by white witnesses was more reliable than that of Africans. This is quoted by Kerfoot, 2018. And this testimonial form of injustice masks a further dimension, that of hermeneutical injustice, which is a deeper consequence of the marginalization of knowledges outside the mainstream. So for Fricke, this means having some significant area of one's own social experience obscured from collective understanding. So where the frames to understand somebody's experience just don't exist. And she mentions early work on gender rights, where the concept of domestic violence didn't even exist. So it was extremely hard for women to get their experiences accepted and understood and eventually taken up as a valid concept. So although Miranda Fricke does not address colonialism and its effects, both kinds of injustice have their roots in colonial conquest, later exacerbated by capitalism and globalization. Steve Biko, the South African philosopher activist murdered by the apartheid regime, sets it out clearly. And we all know this, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The logic behind white domination under apartheid was to prepare the black man for the subservient role in this country. So this was not only through separate and inadequate education systems, but also by systematically inculcating into Black South Africans the idea that their cultures were inferior to those of white. This hierarchy of value extended from people to their languages, which were, and often still are today, considered incapable of carrying scientific knowledge. And we know from Fanon, who said the Negro of the Antilles will be proportionately whiter, that is, he will come closer to being a real human being in direct ratio to his mastery of the French language. And that has been an issue in South Africa and all the colonial contexts. So speakers of indigenous languages are viewed as works, sometimes still are, viewed as other ignorant, backward, inferior, local, particular, and unproductive. That's a quote from D'Souza Santos. So, as scientists stalked across Africa, and I think they like to think of themselves as stalking, but it was more likely to have been stumbling. They gathered knowledge which was then repatriated to the north and incorporated into existing scientific understandings. And in this way, knowledge emanating from the south, entangled in knowledge from the north, was made to seem universal and invisibilized its southern roots. So a monoculture of knowledge in which other knowledges were never acknowledged. At the same time, this monoculture of knowledge discarded other ways of knowing, being, and languaging. And as Santos talks about them being erased, and that he does not mean entirely destroyed, although that did happen, but just made invisible. So we still don't know the masses of knowledge that exists in the world, because it was just never valued. And the effects of this we see clearly in contemporary sites of knowledge production. Obviously the countries have been expanded, the more papers are published and the more centers of learning they have. In the same way, missionaries who did valuable work in documenting languages, creating word lists, dictionaries, and grammars, constructed these texts through northern understandings of how languages work. As a result, and also because these missionaries were not always fluent in the languages concerned, the results often bore only a passing resemblance to actual practices on the ground. Resistance to these reflections of languages were constant, but largely invisible. There's a recent paper by Untitled and which shows how intellectuals speaking this also had eventually a significant effect on the current shape of this also. We still talk about it as having been done by missionaries. I'm just going to skip a little bit now. And then, of course, another feature of colonialism, which I'm not sure is well known, is that the colonial states set up administrative structures, but then they mapped languages onto territories with little regard for the multi-level practices and complex social relations that existed on the ground. So members of a particular group who had been happily conversing in a common language for centuries were surprised to find themselves suddenly speaking two different languages and sometimes belonging to a completely different tribe as they were constructed in colonial times. So as Makoni and Kenny point out, languages have been invented, disinvented, or reinvented, and the multiple acts of resistance form a largely invisible counterpoint.
Excuse me. Hello. I'm so sorry to interrupt. Is it possible for the mic to go closer to the speaker? Everyone online is struggling to hear.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt again. I think now the speaker is muted entirely.
Okay, can you hear now?
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, we did test this extensively beforehand, but things still keep going on, as we well know. So this artwork addresses the silenced history of genocide of the Khoi people in Namibia and their ongoing vulnerability to forced removal in Botswana. And part of the work of Southern theorists, Southern sociolinguistics, is to identify absences and gaps in the Northern archive. So Brown Katz here is scripting the trace of that disappearance. So here only the traces of former ways of being in language, standard chains of meaning held tenuously in place by the few remaining speakers as they crisscross whatever territories remain open to them. And the curator of that exhibition suggested this could be interpreted as an archaeology of an absence. So in other contexts, linguistic practices remain vibrant, but largely out of the frames of recognition. So there are dynamic counter-hegemonic practices which are present, but still concealed by dominant ways of seeing. even when, as is the case in South Africa, they are formally labeled official languages. In another piece, the same artist captures the intrinsic undecidability of meaning, feeling, or affect, the difficulties of perceiving or reading the other, of meeting on equal terms when the other's frame of reference are illegible. And this is one of the central challenges for trying to put together northern and southern epistemologies and ontologies. How do we actually talk to each other when the frames of reference are so completely different? How do we find common ground? And my colleague Catherine here emphasizes the importance of trans-knowledging, exchanging knowledge across boundaries. But this artwork demonstrates how complex it is, how thin the lines of overlap are currently, how deep the meanings not captured in translation. And of course, translation also has a colonial history, because indigenous knowledge was translated into colonial languages and rewritten in terms that made sense to northern scientists. So I want to keep that design in mind. And here, just some examples of ongoing forms of resistance and demands for restitution or reclamation. The insertion of other norms and voices, other indexes or symbols of status and value, other bearers of other knowledges into traditional hegemonic white spaces. Despite these, the legacies of harm continue. Language ideologies or sets of beliefs about what a language is, where its borders lie, who its speakers are tied into wider discourses of value, belonging, and even danger. As an example, not a colonial example, but nevertheless a contemporary one. And so epistemic justice, injustice is that therefore both epistemic and ethical, in that the object of any judgment as to their credibility includes not only what is said, but also the speaker. In this way, racialized social perceptions are perpetuated, particularly those which judge second or additional language speakers as deficient or less credible. In classrooms, the harmful operation of social power and epistemic interactions results in various forms of exclusion, silencing, or resistance. This is amply demonstrated by my colleagues doing wonderful work in some classrooms at the moment. A further point is that testimonial injustice not only blocks the flow of knowledge, it also blocks the flow of evidence, doubts, critical ideas, and other epistemic inputs that are conducive to knowledge, thus hindering the development of alternative knowledge. For example, Steve Biko, again in testimony and trial, talked about the effects on students studying at white universities at very advanced levels. But because their English was not as good as the white speakers, monolingual speakers, they had the experience of being unable to articulate in that space their own experience, but having their experience then articulated back to them by the English monolingual speakers. So not even one's own experience can be clearly stated. It has to be translated through the eyes of the monolingual speaker. Right, so to turn more specifically to schools in South Africa, and what I think we can talk about now after a very long period of trying to do better, the epistemic harm of contemporary language and education policies. As indicated above, bio multilingual education is not merely a policy or a linguistic issue, but an epistemic one. So it deeply affects cognition and human value. In South Africa, in the last national census, we're waiting for the next one, only about 3% of African respondents reported English as a first language. And the census did not allow for indicating bi or multilingual homes. Nevertheless, we can estimate that at least 75% of learners are learning through an unfamiliar language, one that is not spoken at home or in the surrounding community. So although our post-apartheid language and education policy recognizes 11 official languages, and in theory it provides functional multilingualism, which is Kathleen Hugh's term. Most schools change to English as a language of learning at grade 4, if not earlier. So this is a subtractive policy, it's a monolingual policy. This is just a few years of education, and then it's a shift into English. And a research worldwide on every continent has shown that a strong basis in a first language or a familiar language is essential to success in education. There's an excellent, there are many excellent studies, but one particularly in Ethiopia where in different provinces, students switch to Amharic or at different stages. So in some, they have their home language up to grade 3, and others to grade 5, others to grade 8. And levels of success in schooling were clearly on that gradient of how long people were able to learn in their own language. And university admissions were clearly marked in the same way. So there is no doubt that it is an essential in education. Of course, cost is always raised as an issue, a legitimate issue, but publishers are willing to publish in other languages. They just need governments to. And there are new technological resources which we can talk about later, which make costs almost negligible to achieve multilingual education. Yeah, so the effects of South Africa's current effectively monolingual policy are that in a recent international comparative literacy study, 78% of grade 4 children could not read for meaning in any language. By comparison, in the USA, it's 3%, in Chile, 13%, in Iran, 35%. So we are way behind not only the average, but the average in Africa. Moreover, in 2015, only half of those who started in grade 1 completed their schooling, and that hasn't changed in the last 6 years. And of those who started school in 2006, only 13% obtained a pass sufficient for a bachelor's degree, and only 1% for a science degree. So if we wonder why science and maths are not where they should be in South Africa, these figures explain it very clearly. So again, what I'm suggesting is that the current language and education policies and practices constitute a form of epistemic injustice, in that they remove from learners the ability to make epistemic contributions. They're unable to talk about science, unable to argue in English. This is they're perfectly able to do it in familiar languages. And of course, then we need to look at multilingual classrooms as crucial sites for epistemic justice. So here, what I'll be talking about for the rest of the time remaining to me, which is much shorter than I thought, is the Western Cape's Language Transformation Plan, which was a brief initiative because political and governance changed in the province, and it was then shut down. But what was visionary about this plan was that learners could choose any language in any regional language to learn up to the end of grade 6. Now, this was the first time in South Africa and in many other places that this had ever been done. The parents and the children chose. There were often disagreements, and this was one of the most interesting things, is that just because you spoke isiXhosa at home, you didn't necessarily choose isiXhosa as medium, or English would be the obvious other choice. But many chose Afrikaans because their social network was largely Afrikaans, and that they'd been living in places where Afrikaans was the dominant language, and so they felt that they were most comfortable in that language. So it was clear that we can no longer see one-to-one ties between language, ethnicity, or race as it is in South Africa. But things are much more complex, and choice needs to be much wider. But although this was still an essentially monolingual policy, because languages were seen as separate and taught separately, but what those of us who were working here did was add the possibility to use any language or language variety in the English medium, and of course in the other mediums as well, it was less necessary. So it became a multilingual episteme. And here I think it's important to pay tribute to the people who made this possible, because it's very rarely talked about, and yet it was a significant moment in South African education, which was cut off for reasons which are still hard to comprehend. We could go into that. But the then Regional Minister of Education, Cameron Duggan, and his special advisor, Anne Schlebusch, seconded from the Western Cape Education, were incredibly visionary in their understanding of what needed to be done. And they also listened to researchers, which is really rare for politicians and even bureaucrats. So this was a chance when things came together. We also had Fraser, a very well-known award-winning NGO who's worked with multilingualism, promoted multilingualism for decades, led by Neville Alexander, who's extremely well-known intellectual activist imprisoned with Nelson Mandela. We always promoted multilingualism. And we had the University of the Western Cape, where I was with other colleagues with similar histories, and Western Cape is known as the University of the Left, so it was presumably more progressive. But this was a one-off combination of people and thinkers which made this possible. Yes, so the rest of this paper, I'll be talking about findings from a study conducted during the 3-year pilot implementation. And in what follows, illustrate the impacts of this change of episteme, not only on academic performance, but on ways of knowing, speaking, and reading. So this is from a press release by Cameron Duggan in 2008, showing that of the schools who chose to write the grade 6 tests in isiXhosa, 8 of them chose that option, and their results became 4 times higher than their scores in the previous year. So, in effect, where we had a 20% pass rate, it changed to an 80% pass rate. And when we went to after the ANC lost the Western Cape to the DA, we went to the incumbents and we said to them, how can you cut this project? Look at the results. And they said, well, there could be any number of reasons for those results. And we said, well, okay, but can you name them? And they couldn't. So it was clearly a political choice. Nevertheless, it had profound effects for the short term. So the school I'll be talking about is in Delft. It was one of the first non-racial townships. Some fairly progressive town planners, even before the end of apartheid, decided to allocate houses to so-called colored residents and black residents, so that integration might become possible. And early sociological studies showed that it hadn't. People still stuck to cultural boundaries. But by the time we were doing this research, it had changed significantly, and people were looking after each other's kids and sharing all kinds of things and participating together in school events and so on. So what's significant about the school is there are no white kids in it, so it kind of flattens already the gradients of who knows and who doesn't know, and which is the language of power and which is not. There were many other languages, but the main languages were Afrikaans and Xhosa. And English was also in wide use, and different varieties of those languages, not necessarily standard languages. But as you can see, the school had a majority of Black African learners, and we still are obliged to use apartheid terms because these are how they are employed in state planning. But a majority of colored teachers and admin staff. So it was very interesting. Nobody ever knew which language to use when speaking to whom. So they were constantly negotiating the norms of interaction. And not only that, so I don't need to say that. Here's the example of what I was saying. I don't expect you to read it all, but just to show that these three Xhosa speaking kids chose different mediums of instruction. They listed their languages. We asked them, what would you see as your first, second, and third languages? They all had different hierarchies, and they all chose different mediums, although in one case the parent refused to go along with the child's decision. So linguistic identities and identifications are extremely complex. And as I've said, it highlights the ways in which naturalized and previously enforced relationships between language, ethnicity, and race are disrupted. This is an excerpt from a talk that my colleague had with the young Xhosa speaker who was watching another group playing soccer on the field. And so as we see in this extract, continuing tensions flow in from wider social discourses. So we still have older essentialist ways of thinking about race, but they coexist with new ways. And here this, my colleague heard Odwa talking about a group of kids as white. And as I said, there are no white kids in the school. So she thought, what's going on? So she said, why do you prefer to call them white and not the other name that people call them, not wanting to put any names, words in her mouth? And she said, because otherwise they're going to call us, we know we're not allowed to use this word anymore. It's an extremely pejorative term for Black Africans, which was in heavy use under apartheid. But and then she said later in the conversation, and you see, when we're talking, maybe we're talking Xhosa, then we say, yeah, that's white people. So we're talking about colored learners. When we don't want them to hear what we're saying, we call them white. So, yeah. So alongside a lot of conventional racist taunting, which still was happening in the school, you can see these impetuses to not do that, to not cause harm, to deliberately avoid racist labeling and strategically diffuse potentially racist tensions. So here, Porat calls these race bending strategies, so sometimes essentializing race, sometimes not, and avoiding racism in the interest of conviviality. And another young, not child, it's a young adolescent, Ravani, just in terms of identification, this interview shows how he in a sense, has an ambivalent identification because he sees himself very strongly as a Xhosa person, and even though he still loves himself, even though he speaks English, so it can be a tension in homes in various ways. And I should mention in terms of the previous example, white is often used differently in other contexts. It can carry a very negative connotation. If you call a black person white, it can mean that he is over assimilated. There's the term coconut, which circulates widely, which means black on the outside, white on the inside. So, you know, the signification of white, like all racial labels, is contextual, can be contingent and change it. And here we see that Olani made a clear decision. He's clear that it was his decision, and not his mother, to learn English. But he had a very conscious understanding of identity. And here he is, it actually isn't him, these are random kids, but just so you see what was happening. He was a prefect, he was stopping kids going into the small children's playground stationed at the gate, and there was a group of Afrikaans speaking learners, older ones, approaching the gate, and so he speaks to them in Xhosa, which he knows that they don't understand very well. So I'm going to read that in Xhosa. Plenty of people in the room who could, but he says, "Hello, what do you want to say?" So it's a challenge. And what is striking is the use of Xhosa, and they respond in English, saying, "What are you talking about?" And then it continues in English. But we asked him afterwards why he did that, and he said because they're difficult. He knew he would have trouble, so he was using Xhosa to assert his authority, to create a space that said, "This is my language, you're entering my space, so you follow my rules." And so this moment of interaction is obviously then full of historical and contemporary meanings, because he's what we say in linguistic indexing, but he's pointing simultaneously to the linguistic regime implicit in the school, which is Afrikaans as the top of the hierarchy, and the political history of dominance of Afrikaans in relation to African languages, both on the Cape Flats and in Nairobi, and apartheid policies and discourse. So the next thing, which I will go through very briefly, is an extract from a classroom in which Olani is working with two other learners. And the teacher that we worked with as part of the support, in-service support certificate program, she always reminded the kids that they could use whatever language they wanted to. And they were talking about movies, the content is not important, but what I just like to signal through the use of the different colors is the interweaving of the three different languages, so that they are all used simultaneously to engage with the task or knowledge production. Now, I can talk you through this, but I don't come back to it if you would like. So what we see is the presence of code features from three languages in the negotiation of knowledge claims. And all three languages are spoken by all three learners, but they have different official home languages. So once again, it ruptures that naturalized relationship between language and ethnicity. And it indexes solidarity. So they you know, at one stage, Olani offers to speak Afrikaans in case the other kid is not following. But the use, the mix of languages is unmarked, so we could see them as emergent cosmopolitan subjects. And we see the intertwining academic, linguistic, and social identities. Then the last example is another young adolescent called Ensha, also from an Xhosa speaking family. but she had acquired Afrikaans from her friends. And she spent a long period in the hospital when the nurses spoke Afrikaans, and she managed quite well. So what's interesting about her is that she and her mother chose Isikosa from grade 1 to grade 6. And she was doing extremely well. She was top of the class. She used to, in the playground, she would call other kids together and teach them, pretend teach or actually teach. But once she reached grade 6, after she came back from hospital, there was no more place in the Isikosa stream, so she had to change to English. And she subsequently failed and had to repeat the grade. And both she and her mother said that she should have continued in Isikosa. But, and here you see the effects, the kind of epistemic harm that moves into the body of children forced to learn through a language which they don't have as a resource. And she would say, maybe the teacher asked me the question and I'm telling the answer, the students will laugh at me. And so my colleague said, do you think they laugh because you're telling the wrong answer or the way you tell the answer? And she said, the way I tell the answer, because she knew the answer, she just couldn't get it across in English. And there were all kinds of embodied behaviors that indicated her frustration and humiliation. You know, she would look around and not look at anybody, and she would knock the table, etc. So you can see very strongly the materialization of harm in the body. And her ability to be recognized as a competent knower was compromised by her inability to articulate that knowledge in a particular language. So she self-silenced herself. We have ample data in other schools of the same thing. So this is an example of testimonial injustice. She's been wronged in her capacity as a giver of knowledge and prevented in a way from becoming who she really is. However, when she repeated the grade, she failed. It had interesting consequences for her academic identity. She began acting as facilitator for other learners struggling with content in English. So, and again, this is a grade 6 class crammed in with also grade 4 and 5. And I'm going to skip through this data, just putting out the key points. Part of the problem with this data is that, ironically, I need to talk about languages as if they have clear boundaries in order to show that they do not. So I have to signal features from different languages. But in fact, what we're interested in is languaging itself that transcends languages and uses whatever linguistic or other resources make sense in the moment. And interactional data is especially important, of course, combined with ethnography and interviews, but it can illuminate how inequality or other social relations are constructed in the moment. And if you watch over time how those moments develop and either solidify or disappear again, it's just incredible way of understanding how social relations are constructed. And Julian Go, who's a sociologist, recently said that sociology has been missing the importance of interactions all these years. So now we last have something to say to sociologists. Okay, so this was the task. They were asked to identify economic flows, basically. And I could say a lot about these materials, but I won't. The one thing you will see in the picture on the left is that the sun is shining and the rain is raining at the same time. So it's a bit confusing, and many other things are confusing in the instructions. But anyhow, they are asked to identify flows. What I'm looking at is the negotiation of knowledge, simultaneously with the promotion of solidarity. So here, the teacher gives rain as an example of flow, following the picture. She reminds them they can use any language. And then Ensha, who's working with two other Hausa speakers, opens the engagement with Zozo and Tulani, the two others say that they don't know what to do. Now, what's really interesting here is that Ensha also said she doesn't know what to do, and very emphatically, because Haibo is an emphatic explanation, and not the pronoun, which is located on both sides of the main statement, is also emphasizing her position, and yet she doesn't know. She knows very well. So she's creating here an epistemic environment of inquiry rather than pre-established knowledge, and promote, saving face of the others at the same time. And then a bit later she says, okay, we should write a flow of money, and the others agree. And then she checks, does everyone agree with money? So she doesn't just go ahead with her example, she keeps checking with them, making sure that they're on board. And the use of should, she could say we must write a flow of money, but she says should, which is a personal assessment, it's not an obligation. And and then Zozo gets stuck on a teacher's example of rain. So throughout the interaction, she keeps promoting rain, but it's about economic flows, and rain can, of course, be an economic flow, but it's not in the textbook. And so Ensha initially says, okay, maybe rain. And then she says, you're mad. So that's the only time that she explicitly evaluates another person's proposition in some negative way, but she quickly downgrades it and says, oh, maybe you're looking at the wrong example, the wrong activity. And Zozo says, no, I'm looking at this one here. So again, to avoid overt judgment of Zozo's example, she turns to Tulani and says, you speak. So she, no explicit appraisal, and she just tries to repair the interaction and get around the disagreement, and also involve everybody. So, I'm sorry, I'm aware that I'm very long. So they go back and forth on that, and then she sees that there's no agreement, so she says, okay, maybe we should do electricity. And then she sees that that might be a bit difficult for them to explain the flow of electricity. And so then she moves on to clothes. And again, you see the mix of languages in this interaction. But also what's significant about this is that she has all this knowledge, which she acquired somehow in the English class, which she failed. And she's giving it, telling it to these other kids in Xhosa, where she had learned it in English. Now, this is extremely significant in South Africa because we are constantly told we can't expect teachers to teach in another tongue because they don't know how, they haven't been taught the content there. We don't have the vocabulary, we don't have the academic register. And yet this child was able to do it without having been taught in Xhosa, just to get the knowledge across quite easily. This is another big point of discussion. And at the same time, she uses all these features from Afrikaans and English, like or mos, or ne, which are ways of signaling solidarity because they come from the general urban vernacular that is spoken around there. So she's doing both. She's getting learning across, but she's building solidarity at the same time. And then her last one is very abstract, very, what we would call a dense, semantically dense statement, again, that she had never learned in English. So she makes use of all these inclusive, dialogically expansive strategies which serve to build both solidarity and confidence and legitimize others as knowers. And I summarize them there, but I don't need to talk about them. So here, what I'm trying to do is argue that the lack of opportunity to learn in a familiar language at school beyond grade 3 if at all constitutes a persistent and systematic form of epistemic injustice. By contrast, what I'm showing here suggests that anxious practices and those of the other learners constitute an emerging project of epistemic justice, defined here as an ethical project of reversing exclusions, mitigating harm, and seeking equal epistemic authority for previously marginalized speakers of the language. In her first year in grade 6, Angela was not recognized as a learner. She was silenced and mocked by her peers, and she was thus wronged in her capacity as a subject. However, in her second time round, she erased the possibilities of these experiences for others. So she removed the possibility of harm by helping the other students through an example of what Fanon calls receptive generosity. So Fanon says, was my freedom not given to me then in order to build the world of you? Sorry, been through that. So, and this, of course, is consistent with everybody no doubt knows the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which in its epistemic aspects is characterized by open-mindedness, fair-mindedness, curiosity, and competence of reason, but also sociability and respect for others. So this is an example of alternate ways of knowing and being human. A visibility only made possible by a radical shift in classroom, school, language ideologies, and an enabling pedagogy, so a subversion of the normative order. Here, as elsewhere, those outside the Eurocentric core seem to bear the responsibility for rehumanizing humanity and forging new reality.
So thank you so much, Caroline, for this fascinating and rich. We're aware that some of the online participants weren't able to hear so well. Fortunately, your slides were quite rich, but we hope that the majority of those online were able to follow clearly enough. Thank you, by the way, for everyone who's joining us online. And thank you, Caroline. So we'll open the floor. We can take questions from those of you online. You can use the raise hand function. I'll see it on my screen here, and I'll just give you an option in the order that the hands were raised. So first come, first serve until the time is up. We'll start with some questions from the room here. So I see the first hand already from Eva. Please, I'll bring the microphone around.
So thank you very much. So I have a question related to the students that could choose from these three languages, Easy Course, Afrikaans, and English. Did you follow up or jump into them later in life?
Yes, we tried as far as we could, and part of the problem was that the high schools they went into were traditional state schools and constructed along the same kinds of lines, so that they then went into either Xhosa-speaking schools or Afrikaans schools, and in both they had English as a medium. But then, so kinds of emerging cosmopolitanism or conviviality that we saw in the school then kind of dissipated as they went into high school because they were no longer associated with each other. But nevertheless, some of them, particularly Olani, we've been able to follow, and he eventually got a place in the university. So really did well because the admittance to university of kids from these peripheral schools is very low. But no, I mean that was not able to be sustained beyond the primary school because of the structural conditions of the time.
Thank you, Edward. I see a hand online, so Suruchi, one of our fellows from last year, please go ahead. Suruchi, you may unmute, perhaps switch on your camera and ask a question. Perhaps we'll take another question from the room here while we wait for. So,
thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was wondering how this playful behavior gets out. This games are played, and if there is a more ludic way in which they naturally cope with multilingual versus how they choose or make compromises.
Yeah, that's a great question. It reminds me of a lot that we saw happening both in the playground and in the classroom. In the classroom, they were always playing with languages. They were kind of what I'm sorry to use vaccine. I know people outside the field won't know that vaccine talks about ventriloquating, so taking on the voice of someone else. So they would, taking the voice of the teacher, or in the data that I showed, the lady who walks down the street selling corn, meals, and use different languages to play with. And yeah, in the playground, the same kinds of things. So they were kind of meta-linguistically very aware. It's not as if they weren't conscious of, even though they used them kind of normally and in an unmarked way, they still had that reflexive understanding of what was possible to do with different languages.
Thanks, Marcella. I think Suruchi is now unmuted.
Yes, I'm back. Thank you. I was unable to unmute myself, but everything is working. So thank you so much, Caroline, for this very interesting presentation. I wanted to first make a comment. While kind of going through your presentation, I was also thinking about this idea about epistemic ignorance, and that how epistemic ignorance is not just about, a simple lack of knowledge, but it's also about the active production of particular kinds of knowledge for social and political purposes. So, promoting certain languages or demoting certain languages, how they are viewed in a classroom. That is also, it's about neglectful epistemic practice, which goes together with sense of epistemic injustice. So that was one. The other thing that I was curious to know a little bit more is that at the start of your presentation, you had, the coloniality of power, Kikuano's theoretical framework. So, and then you brought in Fricker's framework of hermeneutical injustice. So, through your empirical work, are you trying to show ways that the coloniality of power is being dismantled? Or are you saying that both the processes are there? Dismantling is taking place, but also reassertion of these sort of historical processes of, inequality and racism.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you completely about epistemic neglect, and I think Kasim has a term, epistemic insouciance, which he terms an epistemic vice, because it's almost a lack of concern about, in this case, what the research says and what we should be doing for kids in schools, but a decision to rather pay attention to political and perceived economic concerns and ideologies of English as of course, it is a language of power. And of course, students do need access to excellent English, but it's the route that is important, that how you get there without destroying the person on the way. And yeah, many of the studies in Nigeria and elsewhere show that. And then with regard to coloniality, yeah, I meant to say at the beginning that, I mean, why I find Miranda Fricker's two kinds useful is that the work on decoloniality in Latin America, for example, tends to be very broad and all-encompassing. So it would be more the hermeneutic injustice, the dissolution of large bodies of knowledge that just never appear in the northern frames. And so what I think testimonial injustice as a kind of first stage enables us to see that happening in interaction, whereas we can't see the reconstitution of bodies of knowledge in the moment-by-moment interaction in classroom. Although we hope that addressing injustice on that level by allowing students to use all languages will eventually open other ways of thinking about knowledge in general and whose knowledge should be valued and in what way. But in terms of this data, I think about it largely as a testimonial injustice. Does that answer you?
Yes, thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you, Siruchi. Question from Bram.
Thank you, Caroline. I really appreciated your talk, and I think it's incredibly rich. So much so that I feel it's kind of like a prism, right? Like, right, it's one way to shine a light into something that reflects into so many other dimensions. And I think another previous speaker, Suchi, actually sort of referred to the broader sort of point about coloniality power, and I think the latter form of epistemic injustice actually refers to, right? Hermeneutic. I mean, I have a lot of questions about it, and I'm trying to sort of get it clear in my head. But basically, what I want to, I guess the core of what I want to get to is that in a very sort of particular way, right? Like actually a very interestingly focused way. At the same time, you're challenging the entirety of colonial power in history. Right? So your own study is an interesting way in which you relate particularities and a sort of a universality. And I mean, I don't have a particular, I mean, the question is not how do you get out of that, right? I mean, the whole point is that at some point in the history, as we all know, in broader institutional forms of power, English became so dominant that for many, it's even those that don't want to. And I'm reminded also of Yeshi's talk, for example, but I'm also from a country with a pretty small language in Europe, where most people feel that we have to speak English if we want to be part of a broader conversation, because only Dutch only brings us so far, although now I know Yeshi, we also go to Poland. But so my public question is basically, how do you want to use your work, or how do you think your work can be used in these broader struggles, right? As we confront this, the continuing power of historical colonialism in those different dimensions. I'm really interested, it's a very broad question, I know, but I'm really interested in your take on that, how you view that in relation to other struggles that are going on in relation to the same broad question. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I think the switch to, not the switch, but the promotion of a multilingual legacy is central to this work, because the minute you start understanding multilingualism as the base instead of, say, English speakers or Dutch speakers or whatever it might be, that I mean, even if you speak another so-called dialect of a language, you are still bilingual, multilingual in a way. So if we start thinking about what does it mean to value all those languages in the same way, I mean, to see them all as legitimate. And of course, economics and politics play a role in determining what we can actually do. But if we can push from the ground up and show what happens when you start valuing all languages equally and making all speakers legitimate, then other things start to shift. And that is, I think some of my colleagues who worked on this program with me, Peter Goodman Dr. Peter Goodman and Professor Kazi can testify to the changes in the teachers who worked on this program, that we supported the implementation of that, and how encouraging them to write and think in whatever language they wanted to change the way they thought about how they should be educating the kids and how they should be engaging in other community work. So it seems that if you change things at a very particular level, it can expand outwards within limitations. And it's an extremely hard argument to make, especially in countries of the North, which are so heterogeneously monolingual. But all of us in Sweden and all countries have at least 20% of migrants in our classes who come with other languages, which they are explicitly discouraged from speaking, as students in South Africa are still explicitly discouraged from speaking indigenous languages, even though it's a routine practice because teachers understand it's the only way to get a message across, but it's still covert in most cases. So, yeah, well, it's a conversation.
Thank you, Brian. So Peter and then Michael.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I have a question that probably is very naive because I don't know about the South African situation. But anyway, you indicated that one of the problems for the kids is that there are not enough teachers who can teach in the indigenous language at higher levels. So my simple question is, what is done to improve this situation?
Yeah, thank you. That's a two-part answer. Partly my point is that teachers don't need to be specifically trained, because if this child could do it, they can also do it. And what we did, there are very excellent processes of register development going on in many of these processes to build registers for learning in universities, and two universities recently had PhDs through this also. And there have been, Panel Seco has done wonderful work on bringing experts together to agree on lexical terminology for scientific concepts. But this project happened before any of that was available. There weren't no dictionaries for these terms. So we just said to teachers, use whatever works. If you have to, just use the English term and add people morphological, the E on the end and another on the end to fossilize it in some way. In fact, there's a thesis recently on talking in Xhosa as doing Xhosa, not actually, and that's a side point. But so it's both things. There are developments not fast enough because there are no resources. We can't train maths and science teachers, learning teachers to teach indigenous subjects through indigenous languages. But teachers don't have to wait. The same is going on in Mozambique in rural contexts when there are 3 or 4 languages. Teachers just use the terms that they can match, and they might not be completely correct, but they get the meaning across. And then they are corrected at later stages when either they reach high school and get definition in the dominant language, but at least knowledge moves forward, whereas currently it stops, and there's still a large amount of rote and repetition because students are not getting the message because they don't understand English, so they just repeat it without understanding, which means we have these 78% of students who can't read in any language.
Oh, Caroline, thank you. I think it was absolutely lovely. Not an easy task, actually, to follow on from what Graham was saying, moving from the very, very general universal to the particular. And I think that's absolutely crucial. There were certain references which I thought you would mention, but didn't seem to feature. I don't know how much you know of the work of Jacques Rancière, for example. The idea of the ignorant schoolmaster who teaches a language he can't speak. Right? This is very, very interesting, very interesting stuff, because a lot of what you're talking about is actually in philosophy from the global south at the moment. My friend Lewis Gordon refers to shifting the geography of reason. So that reason is not just simply an invention of the Enlightenment, but there's different kinds of reasons, in other words, thought through in different languages, obviously. So reason is not just one thing with a capital R. Now, these movements and these different ways of thinking are taking place outside perhaps some of the paradigms of linguistics, And I'm just wondering the extent to which you would think that more forms of interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity, in a sense corresponding to your multilingualism, would be important precisely because it's at the academic level, at the level of intellectuals talking about in university departments, that much of this thing has to change. Because if people are still always thinking in one language, if they're only thinking in one for reason, then it becomes extremely difficult to step out of that in the domain of schooling or in the domain of education more general. So I think perhaps some of the ideas that come out of the trend towards creolization might be of interest, and I think that I know that you are into this, and of course the obvious reference would be Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's been kind of arguing this long before it became fashionable in Latin America to talk about coloniality. You see, so I don't know what you think, but clearly the particular the experience of the schools is very important. But if there's to be any radical shift, it must also take place elsewhere in different domains. And I think it seems to me, and not just simply, within the teaching profession and the subject of linguistics.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the challenge of bringing together different reasons is the central task that lies ahead of us, because we can't move unless that happens. And of course, this is an academic debate, but I think what happens on the ground can inform that debate. We can show these different knowledges, alternative ways of being in process that can then be brought into the conversation. And yeah, Rancière, I didn't want to go into teachers too much, but you're absolutely right. And I'm not a philosopher, so I'm also nervous of making any philosophical references. But yeah, creolization is similar in some ways to what de Souza Santos talks about as ecology of knowledges. So that, and he doesn't mean that you just have bunches of knowledges in little silos which somehow interact. It's a fundamental mutual constitution of knowledge, but the route to that is extremely difficult. It's the different reasons. How do you translate between these knowledges? How do we set a basis for conversation? Because just the epistemologies of language, to go back to my field, are so different in the North to Indigenous peoples, and completely different understandings of what a language is, who can speak, who can be heard. And in fact, I don't see any possibility there. I think we have to talk about epistemologies of communication, because then we can talk, we can find points of connection. And it's the same thing, and you're absolutely right, that sociolinguists need to talk more to sociologists and philosophers. We are informed by that. There are two recent volumes by my colleagues, Kathleen Kerfoot and Christopher Stroud, which try to engage very strongly with philosophy, and as Chris Stroud always has in practice in his work. So the work is happening, but it's very small, it's very limited, and it needs to be moving so fast and be entering new spaces. And that's, yeah, the work that lies ahead.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm wondering, is there any country or school system that you're aware of where the kind of multilingual education that you envision is actually implemented and working? And if so, how do they make that work, and what lessons could one learn from that?
No, not that I know of. I tried to check. It worked for 3 years when we had the right governance structures in place, but it's very unusual. I know in Sweden, for example, there's a big push to recognize multilingual resources of all the kids in the classrooms, but the ethos is still eventually Swedish as a medium of instruction with English alongside. And that's the national ethos. So and Canada is doing amazing work on valuing Indigenous languages and bringing multilingualism into the classroom. And they have sometimes 28 languages, I think they have in one classroom. So of course, the teacher can't possibly speak all those languages, but they've become very creative in connecting kids with, obviously, peers who speak, but also community members who can come by electronically and facilitate a discussion or look at work that's been produced. So there are people working all over the place doing wonderful things. And one project I really wanted to mention, which I think can make a huge difference, is the African Storybook project. And it's called the African Storybook because it started here, but it's used in many countries, including Canada, Sweden, and other northern countries. And what they've done is made a platform where you can upload a story in any language, and with an English or Portuguese or some kind of broader translation. And then anybody, I think they have 200 languages online now. Anybody in any country can take that story and download it, translate it into their own language, however small the language, and then put it back up there so that other people have access to it. And this has had a huge impact on children reading, because it just gives them something to read in a familiar language instead of struggling through Portuguese, French. And they're now moving into actual developing literacy materials which can be used in the same way in contexts where teachers aren't well trained. So to try and provide that support. It's completely free of charge, and it costs nothing. So governments cannot any longer make the claim that multilingualism is too expensive and we have to do everything through English.
Thanks. Anyways, Christine's husband, Carl Antonis, has joined us, and Carl, you have a question. So
I'm not a fellow, and I'm very afraid that I can embarrass my wife here. I just want to ask a odd question. If it's out of place, you must help me, correct me. I was wondering while you're talking, and thank you for what you shared. I'm not a linguist, but I'm interested because I'm married to one. I was thinking about what role does music play, perhaps in this whole process of promoting multilingualism, in the sense of empowering, because if I'm not wrong, we have very strong musical traditions in the different communities. And it's about, in the end, of really discovering one's dignity, and one can do that also through music. And we've got some wonderful examples on this campus. And I've actually came across a very interesting project that a few Zulu magicians went to Vienna, and they've actually played Mozart's music, or used Mozart's music in Zulu. They've sang some of the songs or the music that he made in Zulu, and it was just what I've seen on YouTube was just a wonderful experience. And it's empowering for the different people. And in Stellenbosch, just the last example, we've got two choirs that is mixed. Yes. And they actually very deliberately sing one another's songs. And I know it goes much deeper than just recognizing or appreciating the songs. It's about discovering one's dignity through the music, or empowering that. So I was just thinking, what role does music play in this sort of educational process in promoting what we're trying to share?
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you. And of course, all modalities are important, and we can often learn much more through art or music. And my colleague Eric at the back there would have a lot to say. And ways that are less fraught, that mean ways of connecting that are kind of not direct encounters, but enable you to relax and just be something different for a change through another language. Even if you don't speak that language, you can still experience what it is like to sing in it. So I think there's huge potential. There was nothing in that project. We did use drama. I didn't mention that, but we did get kids to create multilingual plays, which were hysterical because they mainly did the parents coming to talk to the principal, contesting various decisions that the principal made. Still remember this. But any way of interacting that is perhaps not verbal, which is so complex and can be much deeper. I mean, Eric, would you like to say something?
Okay, well, I think that's brought us to a good point to end and to go singing, perhaps with something to drink and to eat. For those who've joined us online, thank you again so much. We appreciate your support and your presence. We look forward to the next time in 2022. That would be. For now, thanks for all the questions and responses. Bram used the image of a prism, which I think is an apt metaphor, Caroline, for this rich work that you've taken. Just expands into so many dimensions of the South African reality and realities globally, and you presented it to us beautifully. Thank you very, very much for your presentation.